Welcome back to Materials Development for Language Learning. Lucy, my fantastic co-host, how are you?
Wonderful, Brian. Always a pleasure to dig into these fascinating topics with you, for all our listeners out there.
Absolutely. And today we're going deep into authenticity, a real core concept for language learning materials, authenticity. And we're using the work of Alan Maley and Brian Tomlinson to really get a handle on what that word means.
It's one of those terms you hear all the time, isn't it? Authenticity. But then when you actually stop and think about it, it's not quite as straightforward as it sounds. I mean, it's a whole discussion, a discussion that's been going on for decades.
Oh, for sure. For sure. You could trace it back to like Rivers and Temperley.
Right.
Back in 78.
Yeah. And then Littlewood in 81.
And then, of course, more recently, we have Michan's book in 2005.
Yes, and Gilmore in 2007.
Yeah. And Michan in particular, I think, does a great job of giving that historical overview and a really strong argument for why we need to, this genuine language into the classroom.
And what's so interesting is how the conversation has really broadened, hasn't it? Like initially, so much of the focus was just on authentic texts and tasks, but now it's expanded.
Yeah, it's the curriculum itself. It's how it plays out in the experiences of the learners and the teachers.
Exactly.
And so for our listener, we thought it would be so valuable to do a deep dive into all these different dimensions of authenticity.
So we're going to be looking at what do we mean by text authenticity? What about task authenticity? What about this relationship between authenticity and the curriculum? And then what about the learners? Learner authenticity, teacher authenticity, the context, that learning environment, and even this idea of theoretical authenticity, that is, materials that are grounded in sound principles of learning.
So everyone, grab your coffee, settle in, and if you haven't already, please do hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future deep dives.
And we can get started.
Yeah, let's do it. Our mission today is really to understand what authenticity means in all its different flavors when it comes to language learning materials, and why it matters for making those learning experiences effective and engaging. So let's jump right in, Lucy. Let's unpack this idea of text authenticity. What are we even talking about when we say authentic text?
Okay, so when we talk about text in the context of language teaching, we're referring to any instance of language being used, whether that's written or spoken.
Right, so a news article, a conversation you have with a friend.
Yeah, a recipe, a podcast, really anything that wasn't specifically created for teaching a language.
Okay.
Now, if you look back at a lot of those traditional language course books, some contemporary ones as well, you'll often find what we call non-authentic texts. And these are texts that are specifically designed for the classroom.
Okay, so those dialogues that always feel a bit stilted, or those reading passages that are like simplified, really focused on one grammar point. And the idea there, the thinking, is that it makes the language more manageable for learners. They can focus on specific features, practice through repetition.
That's the traditional line of reasoning. But a key insight from researchers, like Tomlinson and Masuhara back in 2017, they pointed out that this can be counterproductive.
Right.
Because it's not reflecting how language is actually used in the real world. Out there, it's not capturing those complexities and nuances.
It's like learning to swim in a kiddie pool.
Exactly.
It doesn't prepare you for the ocean.
Yeah. So there's a huge body of research that actually supports this view. So Little et al. In 94, Bacon and Finneman, 1990, and many others, including Michan and Gilmore, who we already mentioned. Tomlinson himself has written extensively on this. They've all made this really compelling case for bringing that real-world language into the classroom.
Yeah, and the core argument here is that these authentic texts, they provide this much richer exposure to language, how it's used by native speakers in different situations. And that's seen as really crucial for acquisition. It's not just about decoding individual words or understanding grammar rules. It's about getting that intuitive feel for the language, how it works.
Right, and it goes beyond just that linguistic competence.
Right.
There's evidence that it increases motivation.
Yeah. Because if you're working with real-world materials, it can feel more relevant, more engaging. You actually want to learn.
Yeah, and it develops those wider communicative skills
that you're actually going to need out there in the real world.
Right, and even positive attitudes towards the target language. Absolutely. For example, Wong, Kwok, and Choi found that using authentic materials it can really enrich students' learning experiences.
It makes them more aware of, how English is actually used.
Right, in different situations.
Yeah, so that relevance, that engagement.
That's crucial.
It's absolutely key.
Yeah, but it's not just about throwing any authentic text at learners.
Right, no, of course not.
You have to choose the right texts. They have to be appropriate for the learner's interests.
Their level.
And ideally, they should be exposed to a whole range of genres and text types. News reports, personal emails, casual conversations, academic articles, to see how language works in all these different contexts.
Right, because reading a short story is a very different experience from reading a scientific paper.
Exactly.
Or listening to a podcast.
Exactly.
Right, and this has led some researchers to look at course books and compare the language in them.
To real language, how it's actually used.
What do people actually say and write out there in the world?
Yeah. And what they found is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So there's this criticism, you see it across studies, pointing out this lack of real authenticity in a lot of course book texts.
Okay.
So Cullen and Kuo, Lamb, Timmis, they've all talked about this.
Yeah.
And Tomlinson, for example, he did this fascinating comparison of how course books typically teach learners to ask for help.
Okay.
They often use those really direct imperatives.
Help me.
Yeah, help me, which, it's not how people actually do it.
Right.
In real life, people tend to use these more indirect requests. They're more polite.
Like, if you could, possibly.
Yeah. Oh, or, excuse me, I was wondering if you could.
Right. There are all these nuances.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. And Cohen and Ishihara's work also kind of underlines that, how relying on intuition, it can lead to these inauthentic representations of language.
Exactly.
But of course, there is another side to this.
There is.
Right. Not everyone agrees that we should only use authentic materials.
Especially right from the start.
Especially from the very beginning.
Yeah. There are researchers who've raised concerns about, those challenges.
Yeah.
Using authentic materials with especially lower level learners.
Right.
So people like Whittison, Yano, Long and Ross, Day and Bamford, Ellis, Garianto and Morley, Day, Brown, and Monash, they've all argued at various points that authentic materials can just be too much.
Too difficult.
Too complex. Especially for beginners.
Right. It can be frustrating.
Demotivating. Too much, too soon.
Yeah. And there's this thinking about, making the language more accessible in those early stages.
Yeah.
Whittison, for example, talked about pedagogic contrivance. Sometimes we might need to simplify the language.
For teaching purposes.
Right. To highlight certain features, make them easier to understand.
Make them more noticeable. And Ellis, he talked about enriched input. So that's where you give learners lots of examples of a specific structure within a meaningful context, so they really pick up on it. And then Brown and Monash suggested a more gradual approach. So you gradually increase the authenticity as learners get better, more confident.
Okay, so it's like that scaffolding. You start with the simpler stuff.
Yeah.
Then you bring in the more complex real-world texts later.
As they get better.
Yeah. And Moore actually has some really useful advice, doesn't he, for how to make those more demanding, authentic texts more accessible.
He does, yeah. So things like pre-teaching key vocabulary.
Right.
You can give them a summary of the text before they read it.
Yeah.
Or you can just simplify it a little bit.
Right, or take out those really complex examples.
Yeah.
That might be confusing.
And you can even have them, talk about the main ideas before they actually read the text.
Okay.
So they have some context.
Yeah, that's great. And it's interesting how all these different media are being used now as sources of authentic language.
Yeah, like films, TV shows, even sitcoms.
Yeah, sitcoms.
Yeah. So Tatsuki, for example, found that there are actually a lot of similarities between how language is used in films and how it's used in real conversations. Those pragmatic aspects. So film clips can be a good way to show learners those real-world communication strategies. And in fact, in this volume, Jones argues that soap operas can be really good models for dialogue.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because they're very naturalistic. And then we've got other chapters in the book focusing on different types of authentic texts. So conversational texts, EAP texts, literature, authentic interviews, so much out there.
It's amazing to see all those different facets of text authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
So, Lucy, let's move on to task authenticity now. What do we actually mean when we say that?
Okay, so an authentic task is typically defined as one that reflects real-life situations. So the learners have to use the language to achieve a real communicative purpose.
Okay.
So like persuading someone to do something,
Right.
designing something collaboratively.
Okay, so it's about doing something with the language.
Yeah, not just manipulating it.
Yeah, not just for accuracy or, remembering vocabulary.
Right, right. So those traditional activities like filling in gaps or translating sentences, describing pictures with pre-selected adjectives.
Yeah, those would be non-authentic.
Exactly. Those lack that real communicative purpose. They don't have a real audience, a real outcome.
Right.
With an authentic task, you need a context, you need people you're communicating with, a reason to communicate, and purpose.
Okay, so you're not doing it just for the sake of practicing.
Yeah,
The language is the tool.
exactly.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? Because you could argue that any task you do in a classroom is a bit artificial.
Right, because it's a learning environment.
It's not the real world.
Yeah, it's a good point.
So is it even possible to have complete authenticity?
That's a big debate.
Yeah.
But I think it's helpful to think about different types of authentic tasks.
Okay, like levels of authenticity.
Yeah, levels of authenticity. So you've got those truly authentic tasks that learners do in the real world, outside the classroom.
Right, like going to a market and actually negotiating a price.
Yeah, or helping a tourist.
Right, using their language skills in a real situation.
Exactly, exactly. And then you have those tasks that try to replicate real-life tasks in the classroom.
Okay.
So, for example, instead of designing a real advertising campaign, students might design one for a made-up product.
Okay, so it's a simulation.
Yeah, a simulation.
Okay.
And then you've got those pedagogic tasks, which use real-life skills, but for a non-real-life purpose.
Okay.
So an example would be that classic information gap activity.
Right, where you have to communicate to find the missing information.
Exactly. They're using real communication skills, but the goal itself is not a typical real-world task.
Right.
But all three of these types can prepare learners for real-world communication.
Absolutely. And that then raises the question, what's the value of those more traditional, inauthentic tasks?
Right, like just labeling a diagram or conjugating verbs.
What do they really do?
Do they actually prepare learners for the real world? It's a good question to ask ourselves.
It really is. And we've got some chapters in this volume, actually, that explore this idea of designing authentic tasks to prepare students for those real-life situations.
Yeah, so Chapter 11 by Junyan Ngope, Chapter 12 by Votihang Le, and Chapter 14 by Marie McCullough.
Right, bridging that gap between the classroom and the real world.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about text authenticity, task authenticity. Now, what about the curriculum as a whole? Where does authenticity come in there?
Curriculum authenticity is interesting and often overlooked. One big challenge is that there can be this mismatch between the materials themselves, like textbooks, and the curriculum that teachers have to follow.
Right.
And this can lead to teachers having to change the materials in ways that make them less authentic.
Yeah, that sounds frustrating.
It is. But there are some good examples of projects that have managed to overcome this. Tomlinson talks about a project in Namibia where they took a text-driven approach. So they started with all these authentic texts from different sources, relevant to the learner's context.
Okay, so the content comes first.
Yeah. And then they designed tasks based on those texts.
Interesting. So it's not about fitting the materials to the curriculum, it's letting the content guide the process.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is that they ended up covering something like 90% of the official curriculum anyway.
Really?
Yeah, just by focusing on authentic texts and tasks. They even worked with the Ministry of Education to refine it.
Wow, that's a great example of how those different dimensions of authenticity can work together.
Yeah, text, task, and curriculum, all supporting each other.
Yeah. And in Chapter 2 of this volume, Basma Bouziri actually goes into this issue of curriculum authenticity in much more detail.
Yes, definitely worth checking out.
So we've talked about the materials, the curriculum. But what about the learners and the teachers? How does authenticity play into their experience?
That's crucial. Something that seems authentic to a material developer might not be authentic at all for the learners.
Right, it has to be enjoyable.
Understandable.
Relevant.
Relevant to their needs. If they're not getting anything out of it, then it's not really authentic for them.
Yeah, and Breen talked about this, right? The authenticity of the learner's interpretation.
Yes, back in 85.
And Lee talked about learner authenticity, which is really about how learners feel about the materials. Do they connect with them? Do they react in the way that the materials were intended to elicit?
Exactly. It's all about their perception, their experience, their goals.
Right, so it's subjective.
It is.
And the same must be true for the teachers.
Of course.
Right. If teachers don't feel that the materials are appropriate or they don't fit their teaching style, they're not going to be able to use them effectively.
Yeah. And Chapter 5 in this volume, by Amir Hossein Sarkashikian, focuses on this idea of teacher authenticity,
Okay.
how their beliefs about authenticity affect their teaching.
It's that human element, isn't it?
It is.
It's not just about the materials themselves.
Yeah, the teachers and the learners are part of the equation.
Absolutely. And there's also this connection between authenticity and the learner's culture, right?
Right. Prodromo and Trabelsi have written about this. Something that's authentic in one culture might not be authentic in another.
Yeah, so a text about a current event in the U.S. might not resonate with learners in, say, Greece.
Exactly.
Or even in the same classroom.
Yeah. What's relevant to one learner might not be relevant to another because of their background.
Right, so we have to be sensitive to that.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk about the learning environment itself, the context. How does that affect authenticity?
So context authenticity is all about making sure that the materials and the tasks are right for the specific group of learners, their needs, their interests, their goals.
Right.
And the problem is that a lot of course books are designed for a general audience.
Right.
So they might not fit a particular class.
Right, so a course book that works in a university setting.
Might not work in a community college.
Even if the texts and the tasks are authentic in themselves.
Yeah, the content might not be relevant. The teaching style might not be right.
Yeah.
The topics might not be interesting. Or it might not prepare learners for the exams they have to take.
Right.
And Trabelsi argues that we need to adapt materials
To the specific context.
to the learners' profiles, the stakeholders' expectations.
So it's about relevance again.
Yeah. If it's not relevant, it's not going to be engaging.
Okay, let's move on to one more type of authenticity. Theoretical authenticity.
Okay.
This one's a bit more abstract.
It is.
What does it actually mean?
So it's about whether the materials are based on a solid theory of language acquisition.
Okay.
A principled approach.
So it's not just about what feels right.
No.
It's about what the research tells us.
Exactly. Tomlinson, for example, he talks about his text-driven framework,
Okay.
which is based on principles from SLA research, like giving learners lots of input, making it comprehensible, making it engaging, helping them to notice patterns, encouraging them to use the language.
Okay, so the materials are designed based on how people actually learn languages.
Yeah. And Chapter 7 by Baligizadeh and Javedan Mer, they talk about a philosophy-based approach to this.
Okay.
So having a clear rationale for everything you do based on your beliefs about education.
It's amazing how many different angles there are to this idea of authenticity.
It is, yeah.
So we've covered text, task, curriculum, learner, teacher, context, and theoretical authenticity. That's quite a lot.
It is. And to wrap it all up, Maley and Tomlinson actually offer a really nice way of thinking about these different aspects.
Okay.
They distinguish between authenticity in design, authenticity in action, and authenticity in reflection.
Okay, that sounds useful.
Yeah, so authenticity in design is about the materials themselves. Are they representative of real-world language use? Do they have authentic texts? Meaningful tasks.
Okay, so that's what the developers do.
Yeah, and then authenticity in action is about what happens when learners actually use the materials.
Okay.
Do they understand? Are they engaged? Are they using the language?
Right, so even if the materials are well designed, it doesn't mean they're going to be authentic in practice.
Exactly. And then authenticity in reflection is about what happens afterwards.
Okay.
Can the learners remember what they learned? Did they feel it was relevant? Did they actually learn something?
So even if they understood and engaged, it doesn't mean they're going to get something out of it in the long run.
Exactly.
So we need to aim for authenticity in all three areas.
Yeah, design, action, and reflection.
That's really insightful, Lucy. Thanks for breaking all that down for us. So for our listeners, what we want you to do now is think about how you can apply all of this.
Yeah, all these different types of authenticity in your own teaching or learning.
So we've talked about text authenticity, task authenticity, curriculum authenticity, learner authenticity, teacher authenticity, context authenticity, and theoretical authenticity.
And don't forget those 3 stages.
Right.
Design, action, and reflection.
Right. So your task is this. We want you to try designing your own piece of language learning material.
It could be a short text with some tasks, a dialogue, whatever you think would be effective.
And we want you to think about all these different types of authenticity as you're designing it. Why did you choose this text? How are the tasks authentic? How does it fit into a curriculum?
What about the learners? The context?
And when you're done, we want you to share it with us on our forum.
You can find a link in the show notes.
Tell us about your material, explain your choices, and let's have a discussion.
We'd love to see what you come up with.
We're really excited to see your creativity.
And your insights.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive into authenticity in materials development for language learning.
We hope you found it useful.
And we look forward to seeing you next time for another deep dive into the world of language teaching.
Until then, happy creating.
See you on the forum.
Bye.